out at Thirsty Light afterwards. If I don't go, I'm going to. Yeah. Yes, I knew I'd hear that. I knew that was coming. Hi, Andrew. I haven't said hi to you yet. That's unusual. It feels weird. I know. Okay, not only are there these places to find padlock, meetups are probably the most important point in history. Also, we kind of threw together a YouTube channel. Is that what this thing is? This is new to me, but James, our speaker, has said he'd like to stream this, or try to stream it at least. So I said, okay, we created a padlock channel, and I understand we're broadcasting on the padlock channel now. Wow. We're live.
Yeah, no, I'm getting this.
I'm afraid. I don't know how the Wi-Fi is here. We'll see. We'll see how this works.
And be aware that you hold down the live stream on your device, you're going to have like at least a 30-second delay.
Oh, that'd be kind of cool.
In case we do something obscene up here.
I don't have the motivation to cut you off. So if you do something obscene, it will be preserved in the internet forever. You and Frank done Grant, throw a few F-bombs in the presentation. So, if anyone not yet get the code, call her soon. The code. Is this on the code? Is this running on the code? Nobody get this. Nobody get this. Do not download large files right now. I'm trying to show you. How many bandwidth do we have in there? Pretty big? Of what? Of the stream? Oh, we go. Yes. Sorry. Yes. Oh, not that. Your conference. There's a button that says conference login. Yeah. Okay. If you haven't taken a picture of this, it's about to go away. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Every month it's the same thing, isn't it? On the off chance you didn't know, part of the reason we exist is because Microsoft made a language. They made a language, they made a platform, and padlock honestly has gone way beyond what Microsoft's provided. We're doing, I guess tonight's pretty close to Microsoft stuff. However, a lot of our presentations are just, hey, this is cool. It's available for web development too. So that's why we meet. Intel is very kind, Darren especially is very kind to provide us a space-based meeting every month. Thank you, Darren. And ShareWeb, formerly ArtsWeb, provides space for our website. Now, swag. We should have Amelia Cinetopia and Thirsty Lion tonight. I have the Thirsty Lion right here. I'm an idiot, and I left the Nona Amelia's at the store and Cinetopia at my house. But Lael, she was sitting right up in that general vicinity earlier. She was kind enough to say, I'll go get them for you, Rich. So everyone be really nice to her when she gets back. Yeah, really. So, fortunately, my girlfriend knows her, so it won't be weird that she's not going to ignore her. Our supporters. You notice we have a lot of good stuff going on. We get pizza every month. We give away swag in the big meetings. I don't know if you've been to a December meeting, but that one goes up even a couple more notches. This is why we can do all that, is these people right here. So, let me start with the upper right. Sure ID. Someone here. Craig, I know you're here. Anyone else? Are you the guy today? That's fine. You represent.
We are currently looking for a senior software engineer, .Net, some COM, C++ skills we could have. If you're interested, I won't be at the after party, but grab me after the reservation.
Well, maybe Dan, you'll be after maybe represent there.
I gotta go home.
Me too. IT Motives. Angela, are you the guy?
Yeah, I think I'm the only one here tonight.
What? That's why there's so few people here tonight.
Yeah, what we do is IT recruiting. That's all we do. Most of the software engineers, looks like most of the
have both direct hire and service contractors as well. And I don't know, I'm not really feeling all that hot tonight, so I don't know if I'm going to after party, but if you want to grab me up here in the lobby. If you haven't chit chatted with us, we'd love to.
Y'all realize Angelo comes from quite a distance, and despite not feeling his best, he came to see us tonight. Thank you. I think you are one of the. Yeah. And you've got 217. Robert Half, do we have this evening? No? Okay. Quote Center, Home Depot. How about from Home Depot? What? We even had a new person from there. I thought I was going to be here. Okay. Well, that could almost be Vancouver. Vanderhouen.
Yeah. Hey guys, I'm Andrew with Vanderhouen. Been coming here for quite a while. I know most of you, I believe. Some of you know me. But anyways, pretty similar to what Angelo said, and we mainly focus on IT. We've been doing this in Portland for a really long time. We work with almost every company in the greater Portland area. And we have a lot of software engineer business. I love to chat. About many things. And find probably the afterwards of the life tonight. But give you a shout.
Well, we can check and see if she wants to see.
That's a good point.
Okay. 15 IT resources. I saw him earlier. Where'd he go? Okay. Well, there were sponsors too. Tech Systems. Saw you.
Hi, my name's Natasha. I've been here for 3 years. I'm a senior recruiter with Tech Systems here in our Portland office. We have over 100 offices around the country. Nation's leading and largest IT staffing and services company. Reiterate a lot of what some of my peers said earlier. We work with a lot of the major companies, not just in Portland, Salem, Corrales, Key, and Vancouver, kind of wherever your heart's desire. And I know my card's out there as well. It may not be at the after hours, but please reach out to me. I'm happy to chat. I know most of you are kind of a lot of you want to watch the last years, but thank you for having us.
Thanks, Natasha. And silence, Eric. Are you the representative?
I think I am tonight. We hired a full-time recruiter for Portland, so her name is Stephanie Eltrum, and I don't think she's able to make it here tonight. So I'm not a recruiter. I'm actually a project lead on one of several teams. Science is based in Irvine, California. It's about 4 years old. They are growing like crazy. They're a heavy user of .Net and related technologies. We target not only Windows, but Linux and Mac OS. And we're hiring for several different varieties of .Net positions, junior and senior, and STETs. And you can contact myself or Stephanie, and information after hours. Whatever.
Cool. Thanks, Eric. Thank you very much. And thank all those sponsors. Hey, someone added to this. Maker Faire is happening this weekend, really? Who brought this up? Where? Okay. Maker Faire this weekend. I'll be out of town. Sorry. That's why I didn't know about it. I'm glad there's something kind of there because we were almost 2 weeks out. Squad. Angela, you know enough squad stuff? Just short.
I don't know what the topic is, but Squad now meets at Puppet Lab.
Cool.
Kind of a recent change. Used to do that with Conway XPO. But it's so Squad is, I guess if you had the visual over it, it's more what I call a technical focused QA. Yep.
Good stuff. What is Geek Dinner? That's the West Side Geek Dinner at the Washington Square Thursday Land. 21st, Agile DX changes the conversation. Yeah, you can just guess with the Agile group what that could be like. September 21st, the Xamarin or Portland Mobile.net group is meeting. That's a good one to go to, too. September 22nd, Portland SQL Server. September 27th, Geek Dinner Downtown. That's a blast. Eric goes to that often, too. 27th also has TypeScript and Docker meeting. Now, what?
You need to get off that.
Why?
Well,
Because it's crowded. Maybe we should combine stuff. Honestly, last month, we went down for the Geek Dinner and then just went 4 blocks to Big Tower for Docker. That was kind of fun. And September 23rd, 4th, and 30th, Alina from IT Motives asked me to mention this too. She's friends with Bridget Quigg from way back, and Bridget does comedy and with the tech vent. So, yeah, kind of like the Scott Adams thing, right? Doing Gilbert.
I've seen some of those videos and they're very, very funny. And she pokes a little fun at us, and I think that's something you would appreciate her doing that.
Most of it deserve it too. October 4th, Hat Night happens again. Anyone remember some Chris Sells guy? He used to live here, he used to work for Microsoft, now he works for Google. Yeah, but you know, he's still a family, so we'll let him present. Yeah, he's up in Kirklandish. Just Redmond. Anyway, up there. And then October 6th, Angelo, Wyoming Valley Software Engineers.
Yeah, so Jeremy Morgan is there.
And he's not here now? He's too busy being engaged?
Yeah, he's busy. He's going to present on the Internet of Things that kind of focus on some of like home. Also, he's bringing one of his mini Raspberry Pis that he's kind of configured, and then it's a neat presentation. He's also done some tutorials on various websites like Prototype and other places. It'd be a good presentation.
And I'm sure a lot of you know Jeremy was at Gaston, right? And part-time does firefighting too. And he got engaged.
Firefighter and first responder at Gaston.
Yeah, so. And he's engaged. More importantly, he's engaged. His fiance has been here before with him. I thought she was coming tonight too. Anyway, SQL Saturday, October 22. Anyone SQL in the crowd? Okay. 8? What? Are you going to it? Good for you. Okay. November 1st. Again, Jeremy Foster. We haven't seen Jeremy for a while. He's actually the Microsoft developer evangelist. He's our representative in Microsoft, but he works out of Seattle, and we have such stuff to do. We need to make space for him occasionally. And then finally, November 6th, we do not have a schedule yet, but Doctor Strange is our nerd movie. That should be one of our best. Yes, that'll be a good one. Now, after party. How many people are going to the afterwards? Put up your hands and hold them on high for a while. Really, that's it? Come on. If I don't go, will you go? Okay. Jeez. All right. If you don't happen to know, you just go back. I got you. Thank you. Oh, did you have a question?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Okay. I think everyone's going to be at Maker Faire. Or Grants Pass in my case.
It's this Saturday. And I'm actually
What's that? We used to have code camps here, yeah. Yeah, those were cool. Someone should do that again someday. So, alrighty. Does anyone else have an announcement, a enjoyment? Anyone have to get engaged over the last couple weeks that they want to share? No? Really? They don't want to share that? Come on. All right. With no further ado, you ready, James? Excellent.
We'll need a minute to switch over, I think.
You don't need to.
I need
You need this?
no, I don't need that. No, I'm pretty ready.
Wow,
It's almost good when that fire alarm went off for Apple.
Did you get it?
Yeah, I muted one of you.
Okay. Let me try this one more time. So we just had to tempt fate here because doing live code demos isn't good enough. We need to layer in, camera there, laptops that are streaming. Yeah, so I can't guarantee that something odd like that is not going to happen again before the evening is over. I think I am ready to go here. All right, we got slides. So, hello, my name is James. Thanks for Rich and James. Thanks for having me come down here tonight to talk about ASP.NET Core. And thank you for everyone for coming here and listening and so attentively so right now too. That's really great. Who here is already using ASP.NET Core? A few? All right. Anyone here want to come down and join me on stage just to assist? No? Okay. Had to try. Who's using MVC currently today? The previous version. Is anyone still using web forms? Web forms? All right. Yeah, that happens to all of us, right?
Any classic ASP?
Really? Wow, that's awesome. I actually have a classic ASP app that's still in production, though I've lost contact with the business, and I'm not responsible for it, so I do have that to be thankful for. I got my start with classic ASP, and just got to the point where I was going to have to learn COM, where I was learning COM, so I could develop shared components, to be able to have, the ability to share code across applications. And then I heard of this thing called .NET and ASP.NET that was coming along, and I was like, well, why would I learn COM, right? And so luckily ASP.NET saved me from that fate. And I did lots of web forms development over the years and eventually transitioned to MVC. And I got to tell you, what's happening in the space of ASP.NET Core is super exciting. It's really nice to see Microsoft bringing ASP.NET really kind of forward into what I kind of think of as modern web development. Super cool. And hopefully, if you don't already feel that way, after you see some of the things tonight, with any luck, you will feel that way. So I borrowed this tagline from Microsoft. No, from Apple. Sorry. It's pretty evident, the logo. The only thing that's changed is everything. So they came up with this line last year when they released the new iPhone models because they look exactly like the previous years, right? So how do you sell hardware if everyone looks at it and goes, well, this is the phone I already own, right? Well, they wanted to really drive home the point that even though it looked the same on the outside, that what was inside the phone was completely different. And I kind of feel the same way about ASP.NET Core. I could show you snippets of controllers and views that you would look at and you would not be able to tell me whether that's running on Core or if that's running on MVC5. So there's a lot that you already know about MVC that's going to carry over or carry forward into Core. But that being said, the underlying platform is completely different. So you'll see that in a minute. But again, yeah, the only thing that's changed is everything, right? Even though it may look and feel similar in some places. So it's kind of hard to talk about ASP.NET Core without mentioning .NET Core because even though you can target the full .NET framework, you need .NET Core. We need the Sdk tooling that comes along with that. Specifically mentioning the .NET CLI, and we'll see examples of that in a bit. Yeah, so .NET Core, it's a thing, right? I'm not going to dwell a lot on .NET Core. We're going to kind of be referencing .NET Core primarily through the tooling. There could be a talk completely about .NET Core, what it is, the .NET Standard Library, which you may have heard or may not have heard about. We're going to focus on ASP.NET Core tonight. So the .NET CLI, this ships as part of the .NET Core SDK. It's a set of commands that allows you to create, publish, and test your applications. We're going to see what that looks like. Even if you don't plan on using the command line tools, I think it's important to at least understand and know what's happening there. Because Visual Studio itself is delegating down to those same commands that you would use on the command line. And we'll see that in action as well. You probably know this, but it's worth mentioning. this project is fully open source. And we're not talking about the kind of open source that maybe used to be done where development would happen in a back room, and then when we were done with the product, released it, they said, here, we'll put the source code out there. You can look at it, but you can't touch, right? This is fully out in the open. They're doing weekly community stand-up meetings. Who here is tuned in to the ASP.NET community stand-ups? So if you go to live.asp.net, then you can see it's more or less every week. Sometimes they miss a week if the team is out traveling or doing other things. But they hold weekly stand-up meetings, which is really cool because you can hear them talking about the issues that they faced that week, decisions that we're making, things like that. Plus, you can go on GitHub and look at the issues list, and all of the bugs are there. All of their ongoing discussions about features that they're, haven't implemented or are going to implement are there, and you can contribute to those conversations. You can leave your thoughts. If you have, something that you care about that you want to make sure is considered, then you can be part of that conversation. Or you could fork any of the repos that are part of the ASP.NET organization and make code changes or fix bugs and do a PR against the code base. So it really is a new world. This is a significant redesign. One of the team members said that ASP.NET Core is the biggest release of ASP.NET since version 1.0. Okay? There's a lot that's changed and a lot of things to consider. It is no longer based on system web. There's no, just like Web API before, there's no dependency on system web. And they did this because they needed to break from the past in order to get the performance and the new features and just the new way of thinking into the platform. ASP.NET Core is delivered via NuGet. They've really embraced the idea of a NuGet package. So .NET Core and ASP.NET Core, it's not something that you install on the server. It's not something, the code itself, the DLLs and the packages are delivered through NuGet. And it's a true pay-as-you-go or pay-as-you-use model, meaning that ASP.NET Core itself is modular. If you need something, you take that dependency and you bring that package and its dependencies into your application. If you don't, then you don't have to have that as part of your app. And when you deploy your application, you're deploying .NET Core and ASP.NET Core along with your app. Only the pieces that you actually need. Kestrel. You guys have heard of Kestrel? Kestrel is the application server for ASP.NET Core. It's the only application server for ASP.NET Core. Meaning that ASP.NET Core apps aren't hosted by IIS anymore. Now, there was a period of time during development that they were doing that, but they kind of felt like they were spreading themselves across too many server models, and they needed Kestrel because they needed to be cross-platform. And so Kestrel became the only application server that they supported. You can deploy onto IIS, but you're going to use an HTTP module that you install that takes the traffic as the request as it comes in through IIS and forwards that to your application running in Kestrel. Kestrel, if you haven't heard, in fact, this number is old. So this was earlier this year when they reached 1.15 million requests. I've heard Scott Hunter say recently that they're up on their own hardware around 5 million requests per second. So just kind of keep that in mind as I talk to the numbers here. That 0.05, so if we just take that last digit of the 1.15, that represents about 50,000 requests. That 50,000 is what ASP.NET 4.6 does on the same hardware. Okay, that last digit represents ASP.NET 4.6. This number represents a 2,300% performance boost from 4.6. So pretty significant. Oh, and I don't have Node up there, but this is considerably faster than Node as well. I think they sort of anecdotally say it's 8 times faster than Node, but again, a lot of that depends upon your application, the Node application, and making sure that you're comparing similar things. Of course, the platform is cross-platform. This is actually one of the things that I personally am the most excited about. I've been using a Mac for a number of years now, and to be able to run ASP.NET natively on the Mac, it's just, honestly, it's cool. And not having to fire up a VM just because you want to run a project or run an application and do something quick. This is big, and if you work on teams that are mixed, meaning that you have maybe front-end developers or maybe even designers that aren't Windows-based, you had to do a variety of things to make sure that your projects, your APIs were accessible as they're developing locally. This opens up a lot more possibilities with how you can go about doing that. Let's talk a little bit about environment setup. This has gotten a lot easier over time. It used to be when I gave this talk a year or so ago, there was like this litany of steps that you had to go through to get things up and running. Now that they have the installers available, this stuff becomes really easy to do. In fact, it's very, very similar to the installers that are available for Node.js, if anyone has encountered those before. So you go to .net, so dot.net is their website. They sniff your browser agent, user agent string, and they say, hey, we think you're on a Mac. So I did this on my Mac, and they presented me the instructions about how to get up and running on my Mac. On Windows, you really have two options. If you're a Visual Studio proper, right, the big Visual Studio user, you need to make sure you have Update 3 installed, and then you go and get the .NET Core 1.0 VS 2015 tooling Preview 2. This rolls right off the tongue. Right? Really easy to remember. Yes, the tooling is still in preview, for those who haven't heard that. So some parts or all of what you're going to see tonight, we don't know what the final version is going to look like. I think Microsoft is still publicly saying that they're going to ship the final version of the tooling when the next version of Visual Studio is launched. They're at preview 4. Who here is confused with when I first saw the news about Visual Studio, I kind of was like glancing at headlines real quick, and my mind just thought, oh, they're talking about 2015. Like I didn't catch on to the fact that Visual Studio 2015 is actually Visual Studio 14, right, in terms of numeral count. So Visual Studio 15 just had Preview 4 that was released, and interestingly enough, you can't do ASP.NET Core in Preview 4 right now. I think the previous versions were supporting it, but there's something going on there. So just be aware that if you're using a preview build of Visual Studio, you may run into some problems. It's better to stick with the actual released version of 2015. The other way that you can do this is you can go get the Sdk Tools. And that's not going to give you the tooling inside of Visual Studio, but you'll have the command line tools. So if you're using Visual Studio Code or some sort of editor, that's all that you need. On the Mac, who here would actually be interested in running ASP.NET Core on a Mac? A few? All right. There is one catch to this. You need to make sure you go get the latest version of OpenSSL. Typically, you do that with Homebrew. They have good instructions on their website, so just be aware of that. Once you have that, it's simply you just download the installer, you run it. It's a simple wizard, very easy to do. And that is the end of my slides, and really from here, we just have demos. So give me a minute to switch over here. We're going to start.
Ginger, your Mac hung up on me.
Okay, I'm going to switch over to, in Chrome. We're going to need a minute to get logged in here, guys. Sorry about this. We lost Chrome on my laptop, so you don't have the string from my PC, do you?
I see mountains.
Okay. Give me a second to get logged in here. Thanks for the heads up.
Yep.
Okay.
Screen share.
Her screen.
Share.
Here we go.
Okay.
All right. We good?
Okay. All right. So we're going to start tonight from the command line. And we're going to create a console app to start with. You'll see that .NET Core apps, the only app model that they support are console apps. And then you can add app model on top of that. So an ASP.NET Core app is actually a console app. So we're going to start by doing that. Well, actually, let me make a new folder. So I'll say simple app. And then here, and then I'm going to do .NET new. And that created a simple application.
Hi.
total of 2 files. We have a program.cs and a project.json. The next thing that we need to do, is that big enough? Can everyone see?
What's going on there? Okay.
Is we need to do a restore.
So
even though our console application doesn't define any dependencies, we still need to do a restore so that we get the project lock.json file. If we were to try to run this without it, we would get an error saying that we need to have that expected block file because it doesn't exist. So we're going to say .NET restore. That's going to go to the dependencies that we've declared, which are none, but it's going to generate that log file. So now if we look at the files, you'll notice that there is a third. You notice that there is a third file. We have program.cs, project.json, and project lock.json. Now we can say .NET run. And we get our fantastic output here. Hello world.
Hello world.
What other app could it possibly be? So if we go take a look at this, so I'm going to type code dot, and that's going to launch Visual Studio Code and load in our files here. And let's start by taking a look at program. So this should look really familiar, right? It's a console app with one line of code. Notice here that Visual Studio Code, and I should point this out because this is a step that I did earlier. I already went in previously when I opened one of these projects weeks or maybe even months ago. Visual Studio Code recognized that I had .cs files in my folder, and it said, you ought to think about installing this C# extension. And so I installed the C# extension. You have to restart and enable it. But once that's there, then we start to get IntelliSense. You'll notice that we have information, reference counts, syntax highlighting, and furthermore, now code is saying, hey, we noticed that you have what appears to be a .NET Core project. Would you like to add the assets to build and debug your application? We're going to say yes. What that does is it adds this VS Code folder, and it adds two files. Launch.json is the file that adds the configuration so that we can debug. We can debug our application code. And then task.json is what allows us to be able to do Control-Shift-V and build our application from that task. Okay? So again, class programs is the plain old class, but we have that static void main, which is the entry point into our application. And we'll see as we develop our first web app, that's going to remain. We're still going to have that static void main inside of our web app. If we take a look at project.json, there's a couple things that I want to point out here. So you'll notice that there was no CS proj. Project.json is new improved. It's not angle bracket, right? It's curly brace. It's curly brace, so it's better. You can always tell that, right? Curly braces trump angle brackets every time. Otherwise, you know, we use curly braces and they don't. Here's what I was talking about. This is where we define dependencies for our application, and our application doesn't have any dependencies, so there's nothing there. Here's where we specify the frameworks that we're targeting. And .NET Core App 1.0 is the name for .NET Core. And it in turn has dependency on Microsoft .NET Core App, which I believe I've heard that described as a NuGet meta package. Like it in and of itself doesn't contain any code. It's just a list of or references or dependencies to other NuGet packages, right? But you can think of that as like a top level dependency, so you don't have to add like 10 or 15 dependencies yourself. I'm not going to spend, so one little caveat here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about project.json. Does anyone here know why?
They were reverted back to
it's deprecated, right? But unfortunately today, it's what we have as our project system. So we're going to have to look at it. We're going to have to use it because that's what things are built to use. But it's going to get replaced by a CS proj, which if you're like me, your initial reaction was, really? Like that's an improvement? But there's good reasons why they're doing that. Project.json was initially being developed with ASP.NET Core specifically in mind. Like the ASP.NET team was like, we need a solution for web apps, and we're going to do this thing, and we think it's going to be great. At some point in the development of ASP.NET Core, what .NET Core was and how it was going to be used changed. Along the line, Microsoft bought Xamarin, right? So now they own that and all that business. And so there's more players involved, and .NET Core becomes this like more overarching idea. It's not just about what we need for .NET for ASP.NET Core apps. It becomes a much broader initiative. Given that, they need to think of the project system as something to support every kind of app model, not just ASP.NET Core apps. I saw, who was here at .NET Fringe this summer? So there was a couple developers, and sorry, I don't remember their names. They did a lightning talk, and they showed, like, they implied literally they wrote the code that morning or the day before, but they showed a very early peek at what the new CS project system was going to look like. It was awesome, right?
Yes.
Like, it was so cool. They started with a CS project that we all love, I mean, hate, right?
738 lines.
Yeah, and they just started like deleting things out of it. And before they were done, they were down to this really compact, concise, like only the stuff that you could possibly care about. And this is the coolest part. They had this CS open in like the text editor, and they were making changes to it, and Visual Studio was kind of on the side. Visual Studio was like updating the solution for as they were making changes. It was like live hot recoding of the solution in the project, right? Very cool. And honestly, it gave me confidence, and I kind of could breathe deeply and go, okay, CS Proj, it's okay. Yes. And and this is pure guess on my part. I think that's the way it's going to be. I've commented since then that they're not completely opposed to doing something JSON-based at some point. So who knows where it will land? Eventually. I think that's okay, to be honest. Supporting MS Build is important because there's a lot of automated tool chains that depend upon it. And without having MS Build supported, that's a non-starter to be able to adopt ASP.NET Core. So I think that's an okay thing to deal with. The whole before we move on. Yeah.
I'm a little confused at what I'm looking at. It looks like a Windows, is that a Windows frame, is it a VM?
Oh, what's my setup here?
Yeah, like you're running on a Mac.
I started on the Mac with my slideshow. I'm now on my this book. So this is a Surface Book, and the reason why I'm there now and switched from Mac to Windows is because I'm going to primarily do things from Visual Studio tonight. Respecting the fact that I made the assumption that that's where most of you live, right? Is that true? Yes. So I didn't. When I normally give this talk, to be perfectly honest, I do it 100% Mac. I do it all from Mac, and I use Visual Studio Code all the way. I didn't want to subject you to that tonight. We will see that if we have time at the end. I'll show you what the Mac development experience is like if you're interested in seeing that. Otherwise, we're going to, in a little bit here, transition to Visual Studio proper, as I like to call it. Or Visual Studio, I've heard it like large or big, or, you know, the full version. Did I answer your question? Okay. Okay. So that is a simple console application. But you guys didn't come here tonight to hear about console apps. So let's make this into a web app. The first thing I'm going to do is add a dependency. You'll notice that I am getting IntelliSense here, so that's pretty cool. Even though it's not keeping up with what I'm doing. All right, did I spell that right? Let me see here. Oh, it's not servers, it's server. Okay, and let me try that one more time because it's kind of cool that it actually it understands. It's getting information from NuGet to show me the versions that are available. Right now, there's not a lot of options here, but you can imagine in a couple, 3 years, that list might grow to be right. So I'm going to pick 1.0. I'm going to save, and Visual Studio Code again is trying to help me out here. It's noticing that we just added a dependency, and it's saying, hey, there are unresolved dependencies. Would you like to restore those? We could say no, and we could jump to the command line and run .NET restore, or we could just say, sure, restore them for us, which is actually going to run the command itself, right? And so that's going to go grab the package that I just requested, which is Kestrel, and so that completed. I believe I should have that cached locally. And then we're going to go back over to the program and make some changes there. Okay. First, we need to add some using statements. So I'm going to add 3. We're going to add Microsoft ASP.NET Core Hosting, Builder, and HTTP. And then we're going to come down here and get rid of that console upright. And we're going to add this. And I'll walk you through what this is doing here. So for our web app, we need a host. And so our host specifically is going to be a web host. So we say new web host builder. And then we're going to tell the host to use Kestrel, which is our application server. Then we're going to say configure. And configure is going to take a delegate or anonymous method that allows us to configure the application. And so A here is the app. And then on that, we're going to call run. And run accepts another delegate for doing something with the context. And the context in this case is the HTTP context. And so what this line is, does anyone know what we would call this line, like what this is creating right here? Any guesses? We call this a middleware component. I know it doesn't look like a component, but technically it's creating our one and only middleware component. And what our component is going to do is it's going to write to the context response the string hello world. And this is going to be an HTML app, so let's add some HTML content here. Okay? Then we're going to build our host, and then we're going to tell our host to run. So I'll press Control-Shift-B just to make sure that we're still in a valid building state, and we are. And then I'm going to press F5, and I'm going to press F5 instead of volume down, and run our application. And we'll see some messages here in the debug console, and eventually we get to this part here that tells us that we're ready to browse localhost 5000 in order to see our page. So let's jump over to Chrome. And no, I don't want to explore pages. And let's go to localhost 5000. And there we go. How about that? That's our that's our very first. In fact, this is I would suggest it's the simplest web app that you can possibly build in ASP.NET Core. There are none simpler. And we could do this, you know, let's see, 1, 2, I did a line wrap there, so 3, 4, 5 lines of code, and we have our first web application. So let's dig in a little bit more into what this is doing here, this middleware piece. Now we could take this app here, and we could surround this with curly braces and turn this into a code block. Fix the formatting there. And we could configure our middleware right here within our program file. And we could add multiple components. Who here thinks that's a good idea? All right, yeah, it sucks, right? So we don't want to do that. In fact, we want to do this. Instead of calling configure directly in here, I mean, this is the kind of file that if you'll see in a minute, Visual Studio will generate this for you. You'll probably never look at it, and you'll definitely probably never change it once you do have it set up the way that you want to set it up. So we're going to say use startup, and this is a generic method. So I'm going to use the startup class that I haven't created yet. And then we're going to put our middleware configuration in that startup class. So we'll come over here and we'll say we want to add a new file, startup.cs. And then we're going to create a new class. And you guys can still see that okay? Notice, first of all, that this is just Poco, right? It's just plain old C# class. It's not inheriting from anything. There's no interface that it's implementing. This is based off of purely convention, and we need to have these two methods. We need to have a method named configure services, and we need to have one named configure. Configure services is what it sounds like. This is where we would configure services for our application. We're not going to have it in this demo, but we'll come back here and revisit this when we have our first application. Here, in this configure, this is where we can set up our middleware. Just to prove that we haven't broken anything, let's go ahead and debug this and make sure that we still get the browser. Still building. It's not serving the files yet. I jumped the gun there. Waiting. Waiting. So, you guys hear any good jokes lately? All right, let's try this. Let me see if it. Oh, there it loaded. Okay, so hello from middleware component 1. So we still have a functioning app, but we still only have one component. Well, let's add some components into our pipeline. So now we have a total of 3 components. And I'm a clever person or creative person, so I'm going to name this component 2, and I'll name this 3 just so we tell them apart. Okay, so that makes sense. We have 3 components. This forms the basis of our pipeline, right? So if you think of the request coming in the top of the method, it's going to pass through the first component, down to the second component, and then the third component. Then it's going to reverse, and it's going to go back up to the middleware pipeline. And it's going to go from the third back to the second, back to the first. And let's run our application and see what happens. Anyone have any predictions? Is it going to work? I know the answer, but I was checking to see if anyone noticed. So as it turns out, once it refreshes here, let me try shutting that down. And let me try running. Okay. And then I'll open up the instance of Chrome. Okay. It doesn't work. And we're still only seeing the message from the first one. And there's a really good reason why it didn't work. There's the idea in the setup here, and this would be true even if you were writing a Node application and you're composing this pipeline of middleware, that each middleware gets a chance to vote or to say whether or not the next middleware component should be invoked or whether or not the response is done at that point and it should just short circuit the process and say I'm done. As it turns out, I'm using run here, and run doesn't give us any way to say whether or not the next component should be invoked. So we actually need to switch this to use instead of run. And then we need to add a second parameter, which is X represents delegate for the next component in our middleware pipeline. So I'm going to change this to run. Then we need to, just by switching those to use isn't good enough, because without calling next, it would be functionally equivalent to what we had before. So we need to await next invoke. And calling invoke, little sense is getting in the way there. Calling invoke is what we're telling it to go ahead and invoke the next middleware component. So I'm going to add 2 invokes, and then I'm going to set some breakpoints just so we can see the flow through the application here. So I'm going to set one at the beginning and one at the end of each of these components, and then we're going to run. And so what we should see is when it hits these breakpoints, we should see it falling down through our middleware chain. should see it bubble back up. Okay, and then we'll refresh. Now we're at our first breakpoint. So we're entering our first middleware component. We're entering our second middleware component, and now we're in our third. Now we're at the end of our third, and now we're back up to our second, and now we're back up to our first. Okay, so we came down, and we're coming back up. And a second request happened. That's kind of interesting. We only have one page. I'm pretty sure I only refreshed the page once. Any ideas what that second request was? So how would we figure that out? What if we were to go use the debugger, and let's refresh the page. Let's take a look. Okay, so now we're getting the result that we expected, right? The 3 messages. So now let's there it is. Took a second for it to appear. And let me shrink this down a little bit. It's getting a little intense with how big that was getting. And I'm going to collapse those down. You know, I kept dragging and dropping those earlier. I just realized now you can click on them to collapse those panels. I feel kind of silly at this point. Okay, so we're going to expand context, expand request, and then down here we have path. So our path right now is flashed. So that's our page. That's our initial request. So let's go ahead, and you can see the breakpoints getting hit off to the side as we come up through. And we're zoomed in really close here, so let me make sure. Okay, so now we're on to our next request. So now let's take a look at what path is on the second request. Oops. I managed to click on that, so here we go. And immediately you can see what's going on there. So our page is loading, and then the browser is asking for our fave icon, right? So that's what that second mysterious request is. It's not us, in fact. It's the browser that's asking for the fave icon. And it's kind of interesting to note that our pipeline is not it's not any special handling for the request itself. So regardless of what the request is for, we're sending every request through the same pipeline and performing the same action, irregardless of what the route is, or if it's requesting a file in this case, brute force returning these 3 strings, right? Which is not how you would ever write a web app, but it's what we're doing in this case for the demo purpose. Okay? So this feels like a tangent, but it's not. Now we're going to switch over to Visual Studio, and we're going to create our first MVC application. And we'll see within there that there's going to be this middleware pipeline that's a part of every ASP.NET Core app. So hopefully, now that you've seen an example of how we can compose, very arbitrary simple middleware, that when we see an actual, or an actual set of middleware or an actual middleware pipeline, you can kind of rationalize it a little bit more and understand what it is that's actually being created. Any questions about any of this that you just saw? How does it know that it doesn't? I'm not checking the verb at all. It could be a post. And our pipeline doesn't make any distinction between that. Good question. It could be a delete, and we would just happily run that request through that pipeline, right? Which you would never do, or I can't imagine a real world scenario where you would actually do that. Okay, Visual Studio. So you've seen command line, you've seen Visual Studio Code, you've seen that arbitrary middleware example. Now this is going to start to feel like home, okay? So I did file, new project, and we get a couple of templates to choose from. We get ASP.NET Core Web App targeting .NET Core, or we can say ASP.NET Core Web App targeting the full .NET framework. We're going to do .NET Core. That makes it more portable. We can take that application and run it on the Mac, for instance. Why would you target the .NET framework? If you had an application or a requirement, so let's say you had an application you were migrating, possibly, and you were using some part of the .NET Framework API that hasn't been implemented in .NET Core. That might be a reason why you would want to target the full .NET Framework. For instance, system.drawing currently is not in .NET Core. So if you were doing some sort of image bitmap manipulation on your server as part of your application, then you would need to either go get a package to extend .NET Core, which there are now options to do that, or potentially you could target .NET Framework, but you're going to run that on a Windows server, right? So you need to kind of be thinking about ultimately where you want to land and how you want to assemble your application. We're going to use .NET Core for this purpose, and didn't want to do that. And then we're going to say web application, and then I'm just going to call this first app. Everything else here is fine. We'll say OK, and then we're going to see the second dialog, which will feel very familiar. It's very similar, though maybe a little more sparsely populated. We can do an empty web app, which will look a lot like the app that we just created, with a little bit more stuff. Like I think it has some logging in there and whatnot, but it's not going to be much more than that. We can do web API or we can do web application. I'm going to go ahead and do the third one here, and I'm not doing any authentication, though you could put that in there, and it's going to give you sort of a jump off for identity and whatnot. So I'm just going to choose that option. One of the things that I want to, so while that's creating, we're going to quickly pop open the Solution Explorer here, because I want to show you, if I can get there in time. Visual Studio, now that we have a project.json that has our dependencies are declared in there, the first thing it's doing is restoring the packages that we're going to need to build and run our application. So again, the thing to be thinking about here is even though we're within this more sophisticated environment, underneath the covers, it's still using the same .NET CLI to do a .NET restore. Now it looks like it's done. If I do a Control-Shift-B to build the project, again, I wanted to kind of drive home the point here. Look at the command that it ran to build our project. Okay, so C program files.net, .NET.exe, that program files.net folder, that's where the .NET SDK gets installed. And it's actually calling the .NET exe and saying build. So this is the equivalent of us going to the command line and saying .NET build ourselves, if we wanted to. There's nothing stopping us, even though we're within a Visual Studio project now. And then let's go ahead and run this application. This still take a minute to start up. It's a little bit nicer experience because right off the bat, I don't have to do my own browser switching like I was doing before, so that will feel like it does normally. And then it takes a minute to load here. And you'll recognize this project template. It should look familiar.
This is right now. That's all.
Correct. Yep. Wow, I'm zoomed in really close there. Looks pretty familiar, right? They have a slightly fancier banner because it's a new thing, so they kind of jazz that up a little bit. But it's basically you have your home, you have your about, contacts, very simple MVP application. Okay. Let's stop it and then let's take a look at the startup file, or excuse me, the program file, which is this is where we were creating our web host. And they're doing the same thing. A little bit extra. So here's the new web host builder, use Kestrel. They're specifying here, they're calling use content root to say this is the root of our project. Honestly, we could take this out and it works fine. It was a little redundant to have that in there. Use IIS integration. So if we're running this not on IIS, this is a safe thing to do. It just gets ignored. But if we deploy this into IIS, we need to have, our host needs to have this call so that it can successfully integrate with that HTTP module that will be installed inside of IIS. And then here's our use startup like we added and build and run. So no difference there. If we go take a look at our startup file, or excuse me, our startup class, it has a little bit more going on. So we have a constructor that's taking an instance of iHosting environment. So that in of itself right there is a bit of a hint that something's different, right? Our startup class has a non-default constructor, but yet this works fine. And why is that? Yeah, I heard it over here. DI. So ASP.NET Core has a DI, or dependency injection, baked into it throughout. It's not something that you bolt on like after the fact and say, hey, we want to do DI. It's there pervasively, and you can swap out the DI container to something like if you're using AutoFac or Simple Injector or Ninject or whatever you're using, you can switch to whatever you're comfortable with. Honestly, the built-in DI container has worked fine for my purposes, though I'm probably not pushing it super hard with the kind of work that I've been doing lately. This is what configuration looks like in the ASP.NET Core app now. So even though our project has a web config file, that is not where we put configuration anymore. The web config that's there is very, very slim, and it's strictly just to configure the HTTP module inside of IIS if we end up deploying this. If we deploy this onto Linux, we can delete that web config. We don't even need to deploy that onto the server. This is configuration, and this is, as you could expect, fully customizable as well. We happen to be using a JSON file for our configuration. That's what this line is doing here. It's loading app settings JSON. But then we turn around and we're adding a second JSON file. And in this one, we're using the same name plus this env, which is our hosting environment name. So this is the name of the environment that we're running in. So we have a really easy way to just add to our project dot whatever that environment name is being. I forget if it's dev or development off the top of my head. .json, and that will, any keys that are repeated in there, and it doesn't need to mirror exactly the very first JSON file, but any keys that are already from the first file, the values will get replaced, right? So this is like order of priority. This gets loaded second, so it would trump anything that's duplicated. And then the last one is really cool, environmental variables, or environment variables. Why is that interesting? Anyone guess why that's cool? Yeah, absolutely. So inside of Azure, it's really easy for your web app to go in and define these environment variables. And so you can put sensitive information, like database connection strings or private keys to other services, and those values, those big values, never have to sit in a file somewhere, and you don't have to worry about whether or not that's getting into your source control or not. And so having that last means that if we deploy and there's environment variables that have the same keys, right? So whatever value is there is what's going to get used by the application. We're then storing this in a property. And the reason why we're doing that in this case is because we're turning it around right around here in our configure method, and we're referencing something within configuration. So we need a way to get a reference to it. Under configured services, we're now making this call to services.addMVC. This is a helper method. It's part of the MVC framework that adds all of the services that MVC needs in order to run properly. Then inside of configure, we have a couple of things related to logging. To do logging now inside of an ASP.NET Core app, you're using this iLogger factory, which we're taking, you can't cut off here, but on our configure method, that's one of the parameters, that's one of the things that's getting injected into this method by the DI container. And this logger configure logging providers. So we have two providers. We could add more. You could write your own custom providers. You could use a serial log provider. They support ASP.NET Core. Log4net is close to having a release that's compatible with ASP.NET Core. You add or take away as you see fit the providers that you want. But when you go to do logging, you don't reference the providers directly. So for instance, we would say for logger, and then we would say logger factory. Create logger, and we would say that this is for our startup class because that's where we're logging from. And then we could say logger, and we have log critical, log debug, log error, and we could say log information. We could say hello from the startup class. Okay. You can inside, like for instance, the constructor, you can ask for an instance of logger that's typed to your controller, and the DI container will just go call the factory to supply you an instance that you need. You keep that logger, and then you can use that logger anywhere inside of that class as you need to. And again, the beauty of this provider pattern here, that we don't need, we can change the providers on a whim at any point in time, and we don't have to re-instrument our application because we have that layer of abstraction about how we're making our logging calls. Next, we're going to talk about error handling, but first, I'm going to comment out this section, and then I'm going to go into a controller, and we're going to, on our home page, we're going to throw a new exception and run the app. By default, what do you think is going to happen when we throw an exception? What are we going to see in the browser? Anyone have a guess? Yes. That's a reasonable assumption, right? Because that's what would happen today. Okay, so here's our exception. We're going to continue. And here's the result in the browser. White screen of death, yeah. And just to show you that it's not some weird rendering issue, there's no content. If we come over and open up the web development tool, and I'm on the network tab, I'm going to press F5 to reload the request. So I'm going to, there's our exception again. I've noticed that we're getting a status code, but no content. So we're getting that the 500 error occurred on the server, but we have no information. This is a really good example of the difference between what we have today and what ASP.NET's philosophy around feature and the feature set that's supported. ASP.NET today is more of a, I've heard this described in a podcast I was listening to today, as a teardown model. So out of the box, you get all of this stuff is turned on. And then as a developer or a sysadmin, you might have to go through and say, we don't want to support this, we don't want to support that we don't want to take as a dependency. And you end up having to tear things down in order to get the application down to the whole thing. ASP.NET Core turns that completely around, and it's a build-up model. So out of the box, nothing happens, or almost nothing happens. And so this is an example of that. Unless we tell ASP.NET Core by defining middleware to handle errors, there is no error handling there by default. Okay? So now if we go over to our app and bring back that middleware that I completely commented out, and we'll see how that works. Actually, I'm going to leave that commented out, and then I'm going to bring back just the one line of code that I want to show running. That's this use app developer exception page. So again, every time you see app use, that's defining or adding in a middleware component, right? So this is a middleware component that's going to give us a developer exception page. If we run our application again, we'll see the exception, and we'll see what happens. With any luck, we should see the developer exception page display. There's our exception, and here we go. Who's seen an example of this page before? It's actually really great. You get a nice little snapshot of the code and where the exception was thrown. You get a lot of good information. If we had query information cookie, here's our headers. I think they did a really nice job with the error page. It's much improved over the yellow screen of death, I think. So that's only in code at this point in time. So to define your middleware pipeline, you got in code. Now, so there is a way around that, though, right? So you could have configuration that you're switching on. So, for instance, we could have something in our config file that says, "Do I want the developer exception page at the true false?" And we could do it, which is what the original code is doing, right? So if we go look at the original, where I massacred it. It's already checking if we're running in development, and if it is, then it's adding the middleware to do developer exception page and browser link. Otherwise, we get use exception handler. And in fact, if you just wanted to see what that looks like, There's a couple different ways we could do that. One, I could do this trick again and comment that out and bring in the middleware that we want. Or what development is switching on is if we go to our project properties and go to the debug tab, it's using the environment variable to know, whether we're in development, production, or test. And so if you are deploying in different environments, you just make sure that you're setting that environment variable to the correct value, and then that environment host object or interface that we're getting injected there would tell you the right thing.
A lot of times you see, in real world, I think, is turning that mess up on done by operations.
Right. Well, you could certainly do that through configuration, right? It would be through configuration that I think you would set, like app settings that would say do this or don't do that. Is I think how I would approach that. So there's our exception, and now we should that exception is going to get handled, and it's going to get logged, and then we get to this, basically the route. We say home/error, and we get this pretty view. This is like an end user, look on, hey, something went wrong, right? Okay. Oh, and I always forget to do that. Let me get rid of my exception since we don't want that anymore. And then we'll bring back the code that was there before. And then the last thing I want to show you here, just to keep driving home this point, is that I'm going to comment out use static files and run our app. Now what do you think is going to happen? Once it loads. What's that? Yeah, exactly. So initially, it doesn't look any different, but if I refresh the page, we lose all of our styling. And the reason is if we go view the source and we click on like that CSS file, we get no content. And again, if we go look at the request inside of network, 404. Okay, so 404, and then we'd go, well, let's go see if the file is there. So we'd go to Solution Explorer. All of our static files, this is actually a very simple thing, but super cool. root is not the root of our project, right? That's a folder off the root of our project. We now very easily are able to define that root is the root of our website, our web application. That's separate from the content root for our project. So the nice thing about this is we can put static files, we can have JavaScript or TypeScript that's outside of root that we could be running process like you can be running Glop or Grom, and then we could be copying bundled minified files into root. root is what it sounds like. It's the root of our web application. This was very hard to do in our current world. So it's a simple thing, but it's super nice that they took this route or went this route with it. So here's our CSS file. Well, of course, the reason why this isn't working is because I took out that capability. Again, you get nothing for free or by default. So if I don't add in the use static files middleware, static files will not get served out the file system as part of our web app. It's interesting. That's such a simple concept, but that is so not how it works today, right? And again, the way I've heard this described is that while that seems like a trivial thing, if your application, like if you have just an API and there are no static files, you don't need that overhead. You don't need the overhead of considering that you need to serve static files. Don't have it. Like there's no need to add it unless you actually need it.
So with those guys, basically they're trying to map it to an MVC route.
Yes, and it was correct. Yep, absolutely. In fact, if you think about it, if we changed our CSS link element to point to a valid route that actually turns CSS, we'd be okay.
And if you flip the order of those two, use static files and use MVC, you get the same problem.
That's a good question. Let's try it. I don't recall off the top of my head if MVC, if it can't satisfy it through the route, if it says passes it on, or if it says, hey, that's a 404. So let's just see what happens. I've always seen it defined the way that we had it. So we'll find out here in just a second. Does anyone know the answer to that question, by the way? The question was, do we need to have the static files middleware for the middleware? And the response to that is, let's do a little test here and see. Okay, so it appears not to matter. I have never seen it done that way, to be honest. So there might be some gotchas to how that, you know.
The routes are going to be handled after that's compiled. So option to serve up static files.
Well, again, so keep in mind the middleware. So maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying. That by changing the order, the question was, as the request goes through MVC and MVC says, I don't have a route for that, does it short circuit the middleware pipeline and say that's a 404, or does it just call and vote on the next middleware and say, you can try, I couldn't do anything with that? And it looks like it's saying, I couldn't do anything with that, go ahead and have a go at it.
I would guess it's probably some efficiency because if your static file resolution is ahead of your MVC route resolution, it doesn't have to try to resolve the route.
Right. Right. If it looks like a static file, then it probably is a static file. So
Wait, then it's looking on the file system and going, oh, there it is.
Right. Right. Yeah, and it's interesting. You can actually go. I mean, all this is open source, right? So you can very easily go to the GitHub repo and go look at the uStatic files middleware component. And the code is, there's not a lot of code to handle this, and you can just read it and you can see what their evaluation logic is for the path, right? So I would imagine that one of the first things they do is check to see if there's a file extension. If there's not a file extension, that smells like a route, right?
2 questions.
Yeah.
We'll go back to the top of the file.
Oops, sorry. The scrolling nightmare there. Okay.
The second app settings, is that akin to transformation?
This is happening when the configuration is being loaded, as opposed to with the web config. That's something that's a build part of the process, right? I think. So it's conceptually similar, but it's done in a different way.
And then the add environmental variable.
Yep.
Is that into the app settings, or is that something else entirely different?
It's not. It doesn't refer to the app settings file. So I didn't show you the app settings file, but let's go take a quick look at that. Oh, I lost my Solution Explorer. Oh, no, wrong place. Here it is. So the app settings looks like this. So when it's loading the apps, and we can configure, we can set this app settings file up however we want. Something else that I'm not showing to you tonight is that there's actually a way to have the configuration system map, which you're seeing here, to strongly typed objects. So if you want to, and you get those through the injector. So if you want to, within your constructor, say, I need an instance of this part of the config file, that's this object, you get a strongly typed object with all your settings in there. So the environment variables are just ambiently available, right? They're not in a file. They're at runtime in that environment. They're what's set globally.
So usually based on like the order that you have,
Yep.
but override the values as to which one
Yep.
comes the latest, right?
Correct.
On the pipeline?
Yep, exactly. Okay. Time check, 7:55. What time do you want to stop? Okay, perfect, thank you. All right, so that's, hopefully that gives you a little bit better idea of middleware inside of ASP.NET Core. Again, we started with a super like nonsensical arbitrary example, but then, you know, looking at like, this is how it actually works. Hopefully that starts to make sense that, you know, those use, every time you see app use, it's think middleware. Controllers and views. Let's take a quick peek at our home controller, just to drive home the point that This should look and feel for the most part. There's one difference here from what you would see today. We have public class, home controller, controller, and I action result instead of action result, but it's, you know, you can kind of like reason about that. Oh, that's an action result, and we're returning a call to view. So there's nothing here that would feel unusual. So then let's go take a look at a view. So here's the about view. Again, I mean, it's a super simple arbitrary example, but this feels like Razor. It looks like it is Razor, right? So there's nothing there that's special at all. One thing real quickly that we can show with controllers that I think is kind of interesting, though I haven't found a practical use for this yet. So we can say public class home controller, and notice that I'm no longer inheriting from the base class controller. And we can say public string index, and then we'll just say hello from controller. Okay. So unlike the previous version of MVC, you no longer have to inherit from the controller base class, and you no longer